The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Good morning, and welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everyone, and we'll get right back to business this morning. Rome and Civil Liberty by James A. Wiley. I hope you're reading online with me. You'll find this book at Google Books. If you just type in the title of the book, it'll bring it up, and you can read right along with me. We'll begin at the first full paragraph on page 137, retreating just a little bit for continuity purposes this morning. And by way of setting the stage for the reading this morning, I'll remind you that we're talking about an area of the world that was once owned and occupied by the Bible-believing Waldenses. Okay? And in the northeastern, or rather the northwestern regions of Italy and the southeastern regions of France. In the valleys of the Alps is where the Waldenses, the godly Waldenses, lived, and they were somewhat protected by the Alps from papal tyranny. And they read the Bible, they built their own churches, and they worshiped God according to the leading and teaching of the Holy Spirit and the written Word of God, and they were contrary to the papacy. They would not confess their sins to the Roman Catholic priests. They would not enforce Roman Catholic canon law. And they would not bend the knee to the Pope, knowing that he was the Antichrist of the Bible. And Rome wouldn't tolerate their existence. So the Vatican ordered the civil government of France and Piedmont, this region in which the Waldensian sect lived, he ordered their annihilation. And for hundreds of years, the civil governments, under Rome's jurisdiction, under Rome's control, under the Vatican's control, led crusade after crusade after crusade against the Waldenses until they completely eradicated them from the land. Now, the period of time in which we're reading in this book, is after the extirpation and annihilation of the Waldenses, when the land was back under papal control and there was no opposition. And God had retribution against the papacy and against the civil governments that the papacy led in their attempt to eradicate the Waldenses, the Bible-believing, God-fearing Waldenses, out of the land. And after the Waldenses were extirpated from the land, the civil governments that the papacy used to destroy the Waldenses fell out of favor with the papacy. Or rather, the papacy fell out of favor with those governments, and there became a conflict between those governments and the papacy. You see, in that area of Italy and France known as the Piedmont, where the Waldenses once lived and worshiped God, the priests of the Roman Catholic Church, now in complete supremacy in the land, enjoyed the quote-unquote sovereignty of the Pope. In other words, they were untouchable by the civil powers. And because of this sovereignty, they could commit any crime, and they were not held responsible by the civil governments. The civil governments could not charge them with a crime. They could not try them for a crime, and certainly they could not imprison them for a crime. They were immune from the civil law. And because of that immunity, the priests became more and more abusive of the laws and were criminals, abject criminals. The papacy claimed supremacy over the government, and that if a priest was charged with a crime, it was up to the papal tribunals to try him. And of course, you know, the fox watching the hen house, why the fox goes free. So, the civil governments that once were subservient to the papacy turned on the papacy and insisted that those criminal priests should answer to the civil power and not be excused by the papal tribunals that formerly tried them. Now, a grave conflict has risen now between the Antichrist of Rome and the civil governments over which he ruled. And it talks about this conflict. On page 137, he says, the author, James A. Wiley, says, this conflict, intelligently viewed, reads most emphatically the lesson that in every condition and in all ages, popery is the same restless, intriguing, and malignant principle. No reverse can subdue, as no concession can mollify its intolerant and tyrannical spirit. Though humbled into the dust one moment, and seemingly a poor, pitiful, cringing thing, it is the next as ready as ever to set its foot upon the neck of kings, and to strangle in its grasp the liberties of nations. You cannot break its pride, to do to it what you will, nor satisfy its ambition by any amount of power and dominion whatsoever. Chase it to the dungeons, strip it of all its possessions, still, with the poverty of Lazarus, it will combine the pride of Lucifer. Thrust scepters into its hand, heap diadems upon its head, it will clamor for more power and strive avariciously to grasp more wealth. Leave it to itself, and not a vestige of liberty will it suffer to exist. While a single right of a single human being remains uninvaded, it will not cease to plot. Such a principle you cannot regulate, you cannot reform, you cannot restrain, you can only destroy it. And destroy it you must if you would save society or give peace to the world. And beyond doubt, it is the duty of all to unite for the overthrow of what is equally the foe of the rights of all and the liberties of all. A system which would tread out every spark of intelligence and stifle every aspiration of freedom, and which would entomb the world in the dense shadow of a universal and colossal despotism. Okay? Now, what James A. Wiley's done is just describe for you the ultimate end of the New World Order. If left to itself, Romanism will plunge the world into a universal darkness and tyranny. A universal, global, colossal despotism. That's what the New World Order is, and it's well advanced in our age. Now, James A. Wiley saw it in advance because he saw how that New World Order functioned in the Old World Order. He described for you the Old World Order as it existed, as it is proven to have been has been proven to exist in the Old World Order. And there need not be any speculation whatsoever as to what the New World Order is. That's why this book is so instructive. That's why it's so important that we pay careful attention to what James A. Wiley is telling us. Now he continues, he says, we may be permitted to bestow a momentary glance on the interest attaching to the country which was the scene of this conflict. Okay, we're talking about the conflict that arose between the civil authorities of Piedmont and the Roman pontiff. Once they were perfectly united in their annihilation of the Waldenses, God's people, now God is having retribution on both of them, raising up a controversy between those kings and the King of Kings, the self-styled King of Kings in Rome. It was all over the criminality of the priests and the papacy's refusal to allow those priests to be subject to the civil powers. And the civil governments of Piedmont were sick and tired of the priests abusing the laws and abusing peace in those countries. And they started to arrest the priests and to bring them to justice. And the papacy went on the warfare against the civil governments. He says we may be permitted to bestow a momentary glance on the interest attaching to the country which was the scene of this conflict. It is no ordinary land. It is at once rich in natural beauty and in historical remembrance of a stirring and sacred kind. Now, this is James A. Wiley's reference to the land being once possessed by the godly Waldenses. He says, there stands in grandeur unapproachable Sovereign Blanc. Okay, Mont Blanc is what he's talking about, the majestic, desolate mountain within the Alps that marks the territory of which we're speaking, the Piedmont. And he says there is spread out the quiet beauty of Chamouni, where there the sublimity of Salanches opens to the eye, the astonished and delighted spectator. There set round with glistening pinnacles of eternal snow reposes in almost more than earthly loveliness the Val d'Aosta. Okay, that's a valley within the Alps where the Waldenses lived. Beautiful, majestic place. If you want to treat your eye to a feast of beauty, just Google the Alps or the Waldensian valleys or Piedmont and see for yourself the ancient towns that still exist in those mountains that were once the refuge of God's people. It says, but in this beauteous land we cannot travel a mile without meeting the hideous scars which the superstition and tyranny of ages have left upon it. Flowing with corn and oil and wine, it is yet trodden by beggars. What hideous spectacles of disease and idiocy. What scenes of misery and degradation. Start up at every short distance amid its loveliness and grandeur. And what a history belongs to this land. It is the land of the confessor, okay? This time he uses the word confessor to relate to the Waldenses. They confessed Christ, and they denounced Antichrist in Rome. That's what made them God's people, okay? He says, it is the land of the confessor as well as the persecutor. Okay? The Waldenses professed Christ. They worshiped him in spirit and in truth. They had a copy of the original scriptures translated into their own Romaunt language, and they would not bend, they would not bow to Rome. Okay? And that's what made them head and shoulders in morality better than anything that surrounded them. Okay, everything that surrounded them was popish. Okay, it was a beggarly nation, an illiterate nation, and it was the Waldenses who shone like a shining star from the mountains of the Alps that made everything else look so ugly. Okay, there was a stark contrast apparent to anyone who with eyes to see and ears to hear. The holiness of the Waldenses compared to the debauchery of Roman Catholicism that surrounded them. Okay, this is why Rome had to launch their crusades against the Waldenses, because just the very testimony of the behavior and the manner and the holiness of those people was all that was needed to condemn the Roman system that surrounded them. And Rome needed to root them out, root and branch. And the papacy used every power at its disposal to do it. Now he says, and what a history belongs to this land. It is the land of the confessor as well as the persecutor. Here burned the Waldensian candlestick, which shed its heavenly light upon a small cluster of lovely valleys, while all Europe besides lay buried in deep night. Retribution there surely is in the reverses which the popish party in Piedmont are now called to sustain. The same arm which in other days they employed to crush the confessors of their valleys is now touching themselves. Okay? God is showing retribution to Rome, the papacy, and the governments that once persecuted the Waldenses. And he says, gently indeed, compared with the iron weight with which it smote the Waldenses. Yet what an outcry. The priests of Piedmont already claimed the honor of martyrs. Okay? Who were the martyrs? The real martyrs of the Alps. It was the Waldenses. But now, with the Waldenses completely taken out of the way, the entire region being dominated by Rome and all of its debauchery, God has raised up a controversy between the popes and the kings who served him in the destruction of the Waldenses. And it's all having to do with the sovereignty of the Pope and his priests, being high and lofty and not subject to the tyranny, or not subject to the civil laws of the land. So the kings are against the Pope now. The kings that once did the biddings of the Pope by exterminating the Waldenses are now sick and tired of their popish tyrant and his lawlessness. The darkness had flooded in once the light was extinguished, and now they're fighting amongst themselves. What holy retribution God has displayed here. He says this little drama of priestly pretension and arrogance grew out of a measure passed by the governments of Piedmont on the 9th of April, 1850, whereby the privilege which the clergy, that is the Roman Catholic priesthood, had long enjoyed of being tried only by the ecclesiastical tribunals, and of withdrawing from the civil courts all causes whatever which might appear to them to involve ecclesiastical interests, were abolished. Okay? The civil governments were sick and tired of these criminal priests and now wanted to hold them subject to the civil power, wanted to bring them to justice. Okay, that's a phrase we're all familiar with today. Bring them to justice. And it says these were most necessary and wholesome changes, surely, says A.J. Wiley. He says, by the same measure, the right of sanctuary in churches was abrogated. Okay, by this same legislative process that said that from now on, the civil authority, the civil governments have jurisdiction over the priests and can try them for crimes. That same piece of legislation also reduced the Roman Catholic churches from their sanctuary status for these criminals. In other words, every Roman Catholic church in this day when the Pope was in control were literally embassies for the priests. And when one of them got in trouble, maybe raped or killed somebody, all they had to do was run back to the church and lock the doors, and the civil authorities couldn't pursue them. Now they could clamor to Rome for justice, but it was up to Rome to try the priests. And of course, we all know Rome handles with kid gloves all of her infallible priests. All right? It's all having to do with the sovereignty of the papacy. Okay? The sovereignty means, and the supremacy of the papacy means he is superior to the civil government. The civil government has no jurisdiction over these priests. Only the Pope does and his papal tribunals. So they destroyed the sanctuary status, or the embassy status, or the what's another word? The refuge status of the churches. Okay, the churches always beforehand enjoyed the same sovereignty as the Pope. You couldn't go in without the Pope's approval. And they literally became sanctuaries for criminals. And criminality was destroying civil rest in their nations. And they were sick and tired of it, and they were going to bring them all to justice. I'm repeating myself, but I want everybody to understand, if Rome is left to herself in this country, this is the status of the Roman Catholic churches even today. They are sanctuaries for criminals. And this is why when Roman Catholic Mexican invaders come flooding across the southern border of this country to help strengthen the power and influence of the Roman Catholic Church in a once Protestant land, the first place they go for help and sanctuary is the Roman Catholic Church. Because the civil authorities and the immigration officials cannot broach the threshold of a sanctified Roman Catholic Church. They're refuges for criminals. And so the governments of Piedmont are going to take action. And he says, by the same right of sanctuary in the churches was abrogated. The sanctuary status of the Roman Catholic churches was done away with. And it says this, as well as the former, that is, bringing the priest to justice, had been felt to be a grievous oppression. Okay? Naturally, you would expect the reaction of the priest, the criminal priest, and the criminal pope would view this as a grievous oppression, right? He says the country swarmed with vagabonds and criminals who had no sooner been guilty of a crime than they made the best of their way to the nearest Roman Catholic Church and defied justice. That's how the system worked. The criminals knew that if they were Roman Catholic, they committed crime, they could beat feet to the church, and inside the door, once inside the door, they would be protected from the civil authorities. Now he says, these oppressive privileges had been altogether abolished or greatly mitigated in most of the countries of Europe by the First French Revolution. But they were suffered to remain in the dominions of the House of Savoy. Okay, the House of Savoy is an area of the Piedmont controlled by the French government. And it says the sanction of a modern ratification had been added to them in the shape of a concordat established between Charles Albert and the Pope. Okay, so an official contractual agreement had been written and signed by Charles Albert and the Pope, giving sanctuary to the priests, recognizing the sovereignty and immunity of the priests. Okay, so this is an ancient legal precedent that the current government of Piedmont is now bringing into question or doing away with. So this is a binding contract. These concordats are written in blood, if you will, and now this government dares to overthrow the concordat. Now it says, but the cabinet of Turin, disregarding alike the antiquity of these alleged rights and the force of the recent concordat, resolved that these atrocious privileges should be swept away. All right? So the governments of Piedmont are putting their big boy pants on, and they're going to overthrow the tyranny of the Pope and its criminality. Can't you just see the justice that God is demonstrating before the eyes of the world after Rome and these governments extirpated and annihilated the quote-unquote Waldensian heretics from their realms? This is divine justice that we're seeing here. He says, in adopting this resolution, the Sardinian government made a great stride in the path of real reform. Okay, this is a real reform. This is the kind of reform that the United States needs. This is the kind of reform that the Great Britain at the time of the writing of this book needs. They need to kick out the Pope. They need to reduce the Roman Catholic churches to rubble. And they need to extirpate and annihilate the criminality, the criminal priests, the criminal Pope from their land so justice can be resolved. That is the problem in the United States. That was the problem in Great Britain. That was the problem in Piedmont. And God hasten the day when Protestants return to their senses and do what is right in the sight of God. We'll be back right after this.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, To get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to support Inquisition Update, please do so by supporting First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. If you'd like to contact me, please do so by email. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. Now, back to the book. Retribution, divine retribution, is falling upon the parties who took part in the bloodthirsty annihilation of the God-fearing, Bible-believing Waldenses. Now the Roman Catholic governments of Piedmont have fallen into a dispute with the Roman Catholic priests and the Pope of Rome. And as mild as this retribution is, the world didn't learn a thing from it, and the rest of the punishment of these governments and this papal tyranny is going to be fully realized in the world when Christ returns. We have just a taste of justice, but when Christ returns, all debts will be paid by the papacy. Now, keeping in mind that all the laws that once protected the debauched priests from civil retribution and justice have now been abrogated, have been done away with. And so the priests are upset. The Pope is upset. His sovereignty is being questioned, and his lofty position as King of Kings is on the rocks. All right? And the priestly sentiment awoke. All right? They want to resume their untouchable status. And he says the clerical spirit now awoke. The clergy could not tolerate the idea of being amenable to the laws like other men, or of surrendering the power which they wielded over the persons and the property of their fellow subjects by dragging into their own courts all suits whatever in which they were pleased to hold that the ecclesiastical matters were involved. In other words, any time it was advantageous to the papacy claimed jurisdiction over legal cases that might have subjected the church to responsibility to the civil government, or a priest to justice in a civil court. The papacy and the priest found some religious element in the controversy so as to gain the jurisdiction of the case and to place the case out of the civil courts and into the Pope's tribunals so that they could handle their own matters. Now it says sharp and angry disputes arose on the one hand between the government with the whole body of the laity who rejoiced in their emancipation from priestly rule, and the ecclesiastics on the other hand. So here, now you have not only the government, but the people within the land are sick and tired of these priests getting by with murder. They want to bring them to justice. So it's the whole society against the priests. Now he says the wise and salutary law of the government was denounced by the priests as a sacrilegious innovation. Okay? It was against religion. Hang on a second. Sorry, I had a little cough there. All right, this wise and salutary law that did away with the sovereignty of the priests and the sanctity of the churches, this wise and salutary law of the government was denounced by the priests as a sacrilegious innovation. In other words, it was an attack upon religion. Okay, see, they're trying to put this into the ecclesiastical court. Let the ecclesiastical court decide over the civil government. They're trying to make it a religious matter instead of a civil matter. The civil matter was that criminals were finding refuge and protection and sovereignty in the churches, and that the priests were just as criminal as the criminals who found refuge there. The whole system was corrupt. Now, the papacy says this is an attack upon religion, therefore we will handle the case. Okay, if the Pope's handling this case, guess which direction will be decided? Well, of course, against the government and the people. But if the civil power gains the jurisdiction, then the priests will be held to justice and the churches will be reduced to non-sanctuary status. And that means that the police can just go barging into the church and arrest whoever criminal they find in the churches. All right, he says resistance was resolved on. A circular which emanated from the head of the Sardinian clergy, the priest, enjoined the monks to disregard the law. So here came the order from the priest to instruct all the religious of the Roman Catholic Church to disregard these new laws. And it says a case soon occurred which tested the firmness and sincerity of both parties. Backed by the commands and the promises of Rome, okay, so Rome is directly involved. This isn't just a local matter. The papacy's been informed of this encroachment upon the sovereignty of the papacy and his priests. He says, backed by the commands and promises of Rome, the clergy attempted illegally to restore the jurisdiction which the decree of the chambers had abolished. Okay? They tried to gain the jurisdiction over the case to reinstate the protections of the law and the concordat to maintain the sovereignty and independence of the priests and the irresponsibility of the priests. And he says, Franzoni, the Archbishop of Turin, by whose mandate the clergy had acted, was summoned to answer for his conduct before the civil tribunals. He treated the summons with silent contempt. The haughty prelate was apprehended and conveyed to prison. Okay, so this is push come to shove. The archbishop's responsible for all of this rebellion against the civil government, and the civil government put on his big boy pants and arrested the dude and brought him to prison. So they're not taking any more guff from Rome. They're not taking any more guff from the priests. And they're going to bring this guy to justice. And in thereby doing, bringing the papacy to justice, even though they couldn't lay their hands on the papacy, they're going to make an example out of this archbishop. And he said, and thus ended the first act of this singular drama. Okay, this is just one little drama that James A. Wiley is bringing to our recollection. And he says, Franzoni's captivity lasted only 14 days. Okay, the civil government was only able to keep this archbishop in prison for 14 days. And his return from prison was the signal for a renewal of the agitation. Okay, once the archbishop was released from the prison, then the priests rallied, in other words. And it says the Holy Catholic Church had been outraged in the person of her faithful son, and it became her to wipe off the effrontery and vindicate her insulted dignity. So now they've aroused the whole wrath of the Roman Catholic Church, and they want vengeance. And it says the entire priesthood of Savoy, from the archbishop downwards, burned with the desire of revenge. But for some time, no suitable occasion presented itself. The Vatican was consulted, but the oracle of the Quirinal, that is the capital O and the capital Q, that is the Pope of Rome, counseled forbearance meanwhile. So the Vatican's just saying, bide your time. We're going to have vengeance. It may not be fitting for the crime, but there's going to arise an opportunity where we will put a period at the end of this story. Now it says, at length an opportunity of vengeance offered, not such as sacerdotal malignity could have wished, but much too good to be passed on. Santa Rosa, who had made himself conspicuous as a member of the cabinet which introduced the quote-unquote sacrilegious law, that law which made the monk and the layman equal before the tribunals, which allocated civil causes to civil judges, and which decreed that the doors of the sanctuary should no longer shut out justice in her pursuit of the robber and the murderer, Santa Rosa, we say, fell sick. Okay? So one of the principal civil authorities, Santa Rosa, fell ill. And it says, in a few days, his physicians pronounced his case hopeless. So Santa Rosa's going to die. Guess what rolls into action at this point? Santa Rosa, being Roman Catholic, is going to depend upon the priest for extreme unction, for last rites, okay? An opportunity to confess his last sins, an opportunity to buy his salvation through an indulgence or a payment to the priest, or a bequeathal of his wealth to the Roman Catholic Church. Typical Roman Catholicism is going to cash in on this death. But guess what the Pope does? It says, in a few days his physicians pronounced his case hopeless. The dying minister besought the parochial clergy to administer him the last offices of the church, that is, the last rites. And he says he was for some days put off with excuses. In other words, the priests, who are normally right there at the bedside, as soon as they get wind of one of their faithful is about to die, they go to cash in. They go to threaten purgatory, eternal flames in hell, and that if you must confess all of your sins, and you must give money for prayers of masses, the saying of masses after you die to shorten your time in purgatory. You got to make a deal with the church, Santa Rosa. But in this case, the priests, who are normally running over themselves to get to the deathbed to cash in, ka-ching, ka-ching, they wasting their time. They're not running to his deathbed. Now he says, time pressed, and the importunities of the sick man and his friends were renewed. But when did Rome forgive an injury which she was unable to avenge? And when did she spare an offender who was fully in her power? Santa Rosa was told that on one condition only could last rites be administered, namely, that he should express his penitence for his guilty share in the sacrilegious law. You want forgiveness of your sins, Santa Rosa? You want your time in the flaming hells of purgatory reduced? Then you rescind the laws that subject my priests to your justice. That's the deal. And if you don't rescind the laws, no amount of money will buy you out of purgatory. And we're even going to deny you a Christian burial. Your body can lay in the sun to rot, just like the Waldenses, who you slew for the Pope 100 years ago. Your bones will bleach in the sun just like did theirs. You see how Rome deals with her faithful? Santa Rosa was told that on one condition only could the last rites be administered, namely that he should express his penitence for his guilty share in the sacrilegious law. The dying man courageously replied that, quote, he knew how to reconcile his duty to his country with his duty to God, unquote. In other words, No deal. No deal. Santa Rosa was willing to spend an eternity in purgatory to bring the priest to justice. Now, I admit, there's no purgatory, and Santa Rosa may well have known this. Many Roman Catholics don't hold to the dogmatic teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, whether or not Santa Rosa believed that he would spend an eternity in hell for turning away the priests and the Pope on this potential deal, God only knows. But the fact remains, the man stood his ground and breathed his last breath unmoved. It was more important to him to see the justice of the priests satisfied the people and the government, that the priest be held no higher than a pauper and be held to the same justice. Isn't this what Christ preached? That we should be no respecter of persons, that all should be judged with a blinder over his eyes, equal justice under the law of God, no discrimination, no privilege for rank, no privilege for privilege. That in God's eyes we're all sinners, and not one better than the other. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God, and justice is rendered equally from one end of the spectrum to the other. No one will be able to accuse God of favoritism, and he expects the same from his people. Blind justice, divine justice, according to God's law, it's holy and immutable and eternal. There's no justice but God's justice. Man's justice falls to the ground as criminality compared to God's justice. But this man was unmoved by even the threat of eternal torment in the question over whether the priests and the churches are truly above everyone else. I would to God that there be the same justice in this country that calls itself Christian. Is there a Santa Rosa in the United States of America that will convict a senator, a congressman, a president, world-class criminals? George W. Bush was a world-class criminal. Is there a Santa Rosa in this country that would bring him to justice? Bill Clinton was a world-class crusader. Is there a Santa Rosa in this country that would bring him to justice? Ronald Wilson Reagan was a papal tyrant, a crusader for the Pope, responsible for the bloods of hundreds of thousands of people. Is there a Santa Rosa in this country that would bring that man to justice? No, because Rome controls all the tribunals in this country, even the Supreme Court, which has a supermajority Roman Catholic constituency on that court. When Rome controls, there is no justice. When Rome controls, there's nothing but privilege for the criminals and persecution for the righteous. Can we dare call this a Christian country? Santa Rosa was told that on one condition only could the last rites be administered, namely that he should express his penitence for his guilty share in the sacrilegious law that made all the priests and the Pope equal with a pauper. He says, the dying man courageously replied, I know how to reconcile my duty with my country and my duty to God. Other cabinet ministers interposed their influence, but in vain. And the minister breathed his last, unhouseled and unannealed. Two words that have fallen into disuse, which simply means he was unmoved. He died unmoved. He says the minister of war, listen to this, the minister of war applied to the archbishop to know if it was by his orders that the viaticum had been refused to Mr. Santa Rosa, and received an answer in the affirmative. The archbishop admitted it was by his order that last rites be withheld from Santa Rosa. Now you got to know this outraged the people. Okay? And it says the excitement was intense in the city of Turin when the intelligence was published, and the popular indignation against priestly intolerance was raised to its utmost pitch when it became known that the vengeance of the monks was not yet appeased, and that not content with the virtual excommunication of the minister for the crime of curtailing their privileges, they had resolved to deny the rites of sepulture to his body. The exasperated crowd, uttering threats of vengeance, proceeded to the convent of the order of the Servites. They are called Servites because they're so-called the servants of Christ, where laying hands on a monk who was too obese to make his escape with the rest and too frightened not to do whatever he was bidden, the populace soon made arrangements for the captured priest for the performance of the offices of sepulture. So under duress, they have kidnapped this fat priest, and they're going to force him to give Santa Rosa a proper burial. It says the body of the unshriven minister was followed to the grave by all the members of the government, the army, the National Guard, and all classes of the citizens, and the decorum was undisturbed, save when the chance appearance of a priest provoked some sally of the popular hate. In other words, all the people were against the priests. And this is typical throughout the Roman Catholic world. The people are always outraged by this so-called supremacy. They depend upon these priests for salvation, but secretly they hate them. All right? And it says the Archbishop Franzoni was requested by the government to resign his see. And on his refusal, he was apprehended in his palace and sent under a strong escort to the distant fortress of Fontestrada. During the journey, wrote the correspondent of the Opinione, he supported with the indifference of a Stoic the hisses with which he was greeted as he passed through the different villages. So the whole Piedmontese region was up in arms about this archbishop who ordered this atrocity. And it says, this is the old battle of supremacy, says James A. Wiley. It is strange that at this moment, when the idea of Rome claiming jurisdiction over temporal affairs and civil rulers is generally scouted, though only by those who do not know her, Rome herself should so openly and so audaciously advance that claim. That such was the claim involved in the Piedmontese quarrel appears undeniably from the following extract taken from the correspondence to which this matter has given rise between the courts of Turin and Rome, which is interesting as being a recent deliverance of the Roman see on the famous question of supremacy. Now we're going to learn what, out of the Pope's words, the word supremacy means. He says, we pray our readers to mark well its importance. This is a quote. He, in reference to Cardinal Antonelli, Prime Minister of the Pope, briefly alludes to the Concordat solemnly concluded with Piedmont, and then proposes the question, quote, whether a state, particularly a Catholic one, may, on changing its political organization, disregard the disciplinary rights of the Church without the consent of the Holy See. Oh, I hate that I've run out of time at this particular portion of the reading. I'll just have to leave you hanging until tomorrow. But we're going to get to the roots of Roman Catholic canon law and what this concordat, this diabolical concordat, really means. And we'll explain it to you in a way that you can understand it and that you can even recognize it in your own country. Okay? I hope to open your eyes tomorrow on the broadcast. I hope you'll be here to hear it. You've been listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. I would appreciate your prayers as I continue Rome and Civil Liberty by James A. Wiley. I'll see you tomorrow.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.